The Israelites followed the pillar of fire and the cloud of smoke of God all the way from Egyptian slavery to the very edge of the land that God had promised to Abraham. It was a good land with good soil, full of life and resources. When they arrived at the border of this new land, they saw that it wasn't empty. There were people living in the land, whole countries with armies and fortified cities. God didn't hesitate. He told Moses to lead the people into the promised land and drive out the people living there. The Israelites, however, thought a more logical approach would be better. Let's send some spies into the land first, they said. God showed his mercy and agreed to let them send spies into the land. So they chose 12 men, one for every one of the ancestral families or tribes of Israel. These men, which included Joshua and Caleb, were sent into Canaan to bring back a report of what they found there. When they returned, they told of a land flowing with milk and honey. They brought back large grapes and other fruit from the land and were amazed by all the goodness that they found. That wasn't all that they found. When they saw the people and their armies living in their fortified cities, they were afraid and said, "We can never take this land." But just then, Caleb stood up and silenced the crowd and said, "What God told you about this land is true. Now he has told us to go and take possession of it. I say we go." Moses and Aaron and Joseph agreed with Caleb, but the other 10 spies responded out of their fear. And they wondered aloud to Moses, "Why did you lead us here at the edge of the promised land just to die? We could have died back in Egypt." The 10 spies didn't keep their grumblings to themselves either. They began to wander around to the people and spread their story and their fear. And as they told their story, it got bigger and bigger. "The people are giants," they said. "They can appear like magic," they said. "They can throw fireballs from their hands," they said. "They stand at the edge of the road with their magic and declare that we cannot get past them."
You shall not pass!
Okay, maybe they didn't say all those things, but what they did say was just as equally far-fetched. They said, "We scouted out the land from one end to the other, and it's a land that swallows people whole. Everybody we saw was huge, while we even saw the Nephilim giants there. Alongside them, we felt like grasshoppers, and they looked down on us like we were grasshoppers." Well, when the people heard this, they responded as they had to every hardship along the way. They grumbled and they complained. Moses and Aaron and Caleb and Joshua tried to convince them that God was big enough to save them and to defeat their enemies, but they refused to listen. Once again, they yelled at Moses for ever leading them out of the slavery of Egypt. At this, God was angry. He told Moses that he would wipe out the people for their rebellion. But Moses reasoned with God, saying, "If you kill everyone now, what will the other countries think? They will say that you were strong enough to get these people out of Egypt, but not strong enough to do what you promised. Do not let your name and your reputation be ruined because of these rebellious people." After that, God forgave them. But as a punishment, he didn't let them enter into the promised land at that time. Instead, he led them into the wilderness, where they wandered for 40 years. During that time, the people still refused to trust in God. They continually grumbled and complained and found reason after reason to rebel against God. The grumblings and complaints of the people eventually even caused Moses to sin. One day when they were in the desert and couldn't find water, God commanded Moses to speak to a rock, and water would come forth. Instead, Moses and Aaron stood before the people and said, "Must we bring water from this rock to stop your complaining?" Then Moses struck the rock with his staff. God was merciful and still provided for his people, but because Moses had placed himself above God, God punished him by not allowing him to enter the promised land either. The people of God, whom God had redeemed from slavery, didn't respond with faith and gratitude, but rather they responded with unbelief and rebellion. But God had made a promise to Abraham, and he would see it through. So instead of leaving these people, instead of turning his back on them when they turned their back on him, Instead of doing all of those things, what God did was God responded out of mercy. And he continued to lead his people through 40 years of wandering, all the way to the point where they stood once more at the border of the promised land. God appointed Joshua as the head of the Israelites and walked with them as they drove out the people who were living in the land. But as always, the Israelites didn't do what God had commanded them to do. Instead of driving out all the people, they let some of them stay. And this led to generations of war and pain and suffering. But God still didn't forsake his people. Time and time again, he would come and respond and offer them a chance at redemption.